Welcome to a very special series presented by GayTalkRadio.org and QueerPublicRadio.com. In this series, Gay Talk Radio and Queer Public Radio will feature the complete audiobook Invisible Hand, written by Larry K. Mason. Although this audiobook is a fictional account, it could be true. Mr. Mason has designed this concept of a completely new monetary system which would, by itself, catapult the world into a caring, loving environment that we have all dreamed of. To explain his concept, Mr. Mason wrote this book and provides it for free on the internet. Mr. Mason decided to write this book, Invisible Hand, to explain the new system he proposes, which has the ability to change our world as we now know it. With his permission, Gay Talk Radio and Queer Public Radio present this wonderful concept for your listening pleasure and serious consideration. For more information, you may visit Mr. Mason's website at nopom.info. That's NOPOMINFO. nopom.info. On with the show.
Invisible Hand, Chapter 28, Sent to the Office, in which Neil vicariously visits the Old West, meets some new friends, and has to go to the principal's office. Neil could hardly believe his eyes as the bus pulled into the station. To begin with, the bus had horns, not the kind that warn other motorists, but the kind that grace the heads of big bad bulls of Texas extraction. These were longhorns with a spread of over 6 feet from pointed tip to pointed tip. Along the sides of the bus, the color scheme was a mural of the Texas prairie with sagebrush and the occasional antelope in the distance. The bus itself appeared to be quite old-fashioned, harkening back some 30 years to the age when diesel buses ruled the road. Of course, the bus was quiet and smokeless, as were all other vehicles that Neil had seen. But it looked old enough that one expected to see a plume of black smoke billowing at the back of such a behemoth. The door of the bus slid smoothly back to reveal a second apparition that somehow suited the exterior of the bus exactly. The driver was wearing a black sombrero decorated with what appeared to be endless star fields twinkling in the subdued lighting that brightened immediately as the passengers rose to disembark. Beneath the gaudy hat was a serape-clad individual of swarthy visage and a prominent hawk-like nose above a gold-toothed smile. "Adios, amigos," boomed a voice with a pronounced drawl, which seemed drawn directly from the Hollywood studios of the 1930s. Before the brightening lights caused the image to fade, Neil could have sworn the interior appeared to be a saloon. Neil knew it must be only a simulation, because there was no way the bus was as wide and deep as the inside had looked. As the last passenger descended the stairs, the driver rose and clanked down the stairs himself. He was wearing high-heeled boots that any cowboy worth the name would have been proud to keep in his footlocker until he was ready to celebrate reaching the end of the trail with a huge herd by hitting every saloon in Dodge City. They were decorated with flowers and horns of their own, and a shine that was dazzling. They even had small spurs attached at the back, which gave a cheery jingle with each step. Neil was surprised again when the driver thrust out his hand and almost shouted, "Howdy, partner!" "Howdy yourself, partner," Neil replied. "You going on to Albuquerque, Pilgrim?" "Yes, sir, I believe I am." "Well, step right into the Last Chance Saloon and make yourself comfortable. We'll be heading out just as soon as I get finished talking to the trail boss yonder." "Thanks. Don't mind if I do." Neil's escort to the bus station was grinning from ear to ear at Neil's expression and said, "Don't mind Tex. He just likes to pretend that he's still in the Old West. He's really a Greek from New York that came out here to retire several years back and took up driving this bus as a hobby. Fixed it up right nice, he has. Well, good luck at payer school." Neil shook hands with the deputy and turned to climb aboard the bus. It looked little different from other buses inside at the moment. The seats were arranged so that every other row faced the back of the bus with tables between the facing seats. Neil liked to ride facing the front of the bus, so he swung his small suit bag into the overhead compartment and sat on the aisle facing the driver's control console. At least, that looked modern to Neil. There was a wraparound screen behind the steering wheel that appeared to have all the status information and nothing much else. After a few minutes, some other passengers began to board. Most of them were in small groups, but there were a few singles. One of the singles placed a briefcase in the overhead and sat opposite Neil. "Going far?" broke the conversational ice after a few minutes of trying not to stare at each other. "I'm changing buses in Albuquerque for a little town named Golden." "You must be going to the payer school. There's nothing much else out that way. As it happens, I'm headed that way myself. Wellman's the name. Darwin Wellman. Just call me D.W. Everyone does." "I'm Neil Campbell. Good to meet you." And they shook hands. D.W. was what might be called an average 68-year-old white male who has been able to avoid both success and manual labor all his life. He was of average height, say perhaps about 5 feet 10 inches tall and about 175 pounds, with a small paunch. His hair was thinning on top, and toward the front there were now only a few strands left to justify D.W. thinking of himself as not one of those bald guys, thank goodness. "So you're going to become a payer, right?" D.W. commented, nodding yes as he did so. "Perhaps. I haven't decided yet quite." Neil didn't want to go into his reasons for attending payer school, and hoped his answer would deflect attention from his situation. "Well, no doubt about it in my mind. I know what I want, and I know how to get it. The payers have all the real power in this country, and I mean to straighten out a few things so I'm a payer. Know what I mean?" "Not really. What did you have in mind?" Maybe this would distract D.W. from questioning Neil about his recent past. It wasn't that far to Albuquerque, and Neil figured he could tolerate whatever his seatmate wanted to talk about, so long as he didn't have to pay close attention. "You know, there's lots of people who don't get the credit they deserve for what they've done. I could tell you stories, but never mind. Let me just say that—" "Head 'em up and move 'em out," boomed the now familiar voice of the bus driver. The lights dimmed, and suddenly they were in a Hollywood version of a Western saloon of the 1880s. There was the sound of a piano and a babble of voices. Several cowboys sat at a table playing poker. A long, polished bar had several patrons and 2 bartenders pushing large mugs of foaming beer down the bar. At the back of the bus there was a small stage, but no showgirls, at least not yet. Neil could still see out the front window of the bus, and he could see that they were leaving the bus station, but the motion was gentle. An older, bearded man dressed in shabby clothes and worn-out boots approached across the sawdust-covered floor of the saloon and asked, "What's for you?" If Neil concentrated, he could see the side of the bus, but the illusion of the somewhat soiled old waiter was quite well done. He even seemed to be looking Neil in the eye as he asked. D.W. ordered a small beer, and before Neil could think what to say, the waiter spit a stream of tobacco juice into the spittoon located near the table. "Nothing for me, thanks," Neil managed to get out. He didn't know whether to laugh or vomit at the seeming reality of the expectoration. D.W. said, "It doesn't really serve a beer, but it does put the illusion of a mug on the table, and if you act like you're grabbing the handle, it will even make it look like you're drinking from it. It's kind of fun in a way. It sure keeps the kids quiet and entertained. It's all run by the computers, of course. It must have cost the driver quite a bit to have it installed. This is all luxury stuff, you know. One of the regular passengers was telling me that the driver must have spent over $10,000 in getting it fixed up like this. Of course, I admit that he does get more passengers this way, but this is luxury stuff, and he doesn't charge a thing for it. He should make this a luxury ride so people would have to pay for it. Clearly, he's an idiot, but it's his money, and if he wants to waste it this way, we can't do anything to stop it." Neil noticed that a girl of about 4 years was staring raptly at the head of a horse which had just poked its nose in a window of the saloon near the girl's seat. Within a minute he could hear her giggles and squeals coming from her direction as the horse seemed to be talking to her. Neil directed his attention to the driver, who had his feet upon the dash of the bus and was talking to the people at the table nearest the front of the bus. From the inside, the door of the bus appeared to be the swinging doors of a saloon, and over the top of the doors one could just make out a dusty street with wooden sidewalks and the fronts of several stores across the way. "Who's driving this bus, anyway? The driver isn't paying any attention at all." "Oh, the computer, of course. It isn't legal for commercial passenger vehicles to have human drivers when underway," D.W. responded. "They had a bus wreck about 8 years ago when a driver fell asleep at the wheel and killed over 20 people. "Isn't legal? I thought they didn't have laws regulating business anymore," Neil said. "Oh, the legislature still passed laws like that. It's just that nobody pays much attention to them. The folks that make the buses and trains and planes for passengers make them so you can't drive them without using the computer. Now, this is an old bus, but nobody would work with the driver if he actually tried to steer the thing with passengers on it. So one of the first things that they did to it when Tex had this old crate fixed up was to install the computer controls. He could grab that steering wheel right now and try to turn it, but it wouldn't do him any good. The computer does the actual controlling of the bus. Neil and D.W. continued their conversation for most of the trip, with D.W. explaining how he had become a great success in business, several of them, in fact. Upon reaching the bus terminal in Albuquerque, they stayed together while D.W. got his suitcase. Then D.W. asked a nearby TV which bus would take them to the Payer School in Golden. It seems they had a 2-hour wait, so they had time for lunch. There was a fast food type place in the station, but it was too soon to eat, so they looked around for something to do. The magazine rack held little attraction for Neil, and D.W. said he wasn't going to do any more reading than he had to, since he figured that they'd be doing a lot of reading in school. Neil finally suggested asking Jeeves what there was to do. D.W. thought it was a stupid idea, but said to give it a try. "Jeeves?" Neil said to a kiosk phone terminal. "You rang, sir?" "We've got a couple of hours to kill here. What is there for us to do?" "Perhaps you'd like to meet some of the other members of your class at school, sir." "What do you think, D.W.?" Neil asked. "It's okay with me, I guess." "Let's meet them then, Jeeves." "I shall inquire as to their preferences, sir." There was a brief pause, after which Jeeves intoned, "They're approaching from your left, sir." D.W. looked one way, and Neil looked the other, since they were facing each other, and each looked to his left. Neil couldn't tell at first who they were, but then saw 2 women and a tall, handsome man coming toward them. "There they are, over toward the buses," Neil said. D.W. turned and stared for a moment without picking them out, but soon it was obvious that 3 people were looking at them and walking briskly their way. Well, 2 were walking briskly, one limped slightly as she moved. This detracted not at all from her obvious grace and classy demeanor. Her face had an exotic cast, not only in complexion, which was flawless, but also in a slight difference to the eyes and cheekbones from classical English beauty. Her clothing complemented her breathtaking beauty to perfection, emphasizing her best features and concealing any flaws that might exist. Such clothes were far from standard issue. Clearly, this woman had considerable wealth in her background, in addition to that which she wore on her back. She didn't look anything like one expected a payer to look. Neil's attention did not get back to the others until they had come quite close, and the limping beauty was still some steps behind them. "How do you do? My name is Oscar Prudhoe. I'm pleased to meet you," the tall man said, extending his right hand. He wasn't quite so handsome up close, because the lines in the face and the thinning hair were unmistakable to one nearby. The throat was getting a bit of turkey waddle when his head was held a certain way. His hands, though, still able to deliver a firm man's handshake, were beginning to show the ravages of age in the parchment quality of the skin and some age spots. His jacket and tie were in very good taste, but not at all flashy. Though of luxury quality, they did not indicate great wealth, only great comfort. Neil found himself beginning to like Oscar already. "Hello, my name is Neil Campbell," Neil said to Oscar and to the lesser of the 2 ladies. "Hello, I'm Natalie Carraway," she said, giving a handshake of surprising strength, but Neil's attention was already being diverted to the beauty. "My name's D.W. Welburn. Glad to meet you." D.W. got in quickly, and by taking a couple of steps and extending his hand, he was the first to be acknowledged by the regal one. Stopping at a little distance from the others to avoid being rude to D.W., the lovely lady accepted his handshake and said, her glance taking in the others, "I'm Leyden Rutledge." There were traces of an English accent mixed with other elements. It was clear Leyden had been many places in her life. Her face bore the closer scrutiny much better than did Oscar's, but then she was probably 15 years his junior, if not more, or looked it at least. "Are we all going to Payer School at Golden?" Oscar asked with a warm smile. There were general nods of assent and a variety of smiles of varying qualities. They fell to talking, with D.W. doing a little light bragging about his past while looking mostly at Leyden. Oscar seemed to want to engage Neil's attention, and after a few comments began gently probing into Neil's past. Neil's paranoia immediately kicked in, and he excused himself to go to the men's room. When he returned, he discovered that the women were gone. "Where are the ladies?" he asked with raised eyebrows. "They seemed to think you had a good idea," Oscar said, laughing slightly. "It's nearing lunchtime. If we're going to eat before the bus leaves," D.W. observed. "We can't abandon the ladies," Oscar said. "One of us should go reserve a table while the others wait to be found." "I'll go," Neil said, much to D.W.'s relief, which showed, and Neil's relief, which didn't show. So as the party rejoined for the noon meal, Natalie and Neil sat rather quietly while Oscar and D.W. carried on a mild competition for the attentions of Leyden. Finally, it was time to meet the bus for Golden and school. The bus was a small one that would only comfortably hold about a dozen people, hardly more than a large van. It was nothing like the Last Chance saloon. There were no illusions and no fancy paint job. The driver wore ordinary standard clothes except for a fancy belt buckle, 2 gold rings, and the seemingly obligatory decorated boots. This driver was bored, since his route was a local one, and though the passengers kept changing, the scenery did not. There were several other passengers on the bus besides the payer school party, but none of them looked to Neil as if they were prospective payers. Some of them were obviously too young. The only two older passengers were a black woman of indeterminate though advanced age who somehow seemed to belong in the desolate landscape outside, and an older man who sat in the back and looked ordinary. He seemed to lack the outgoing, people-oriented personality that Neil associated with payers. "Does anybody know when we get to Golden?" Layden asked of the passengers. The stolid back of the driver seemed to reject questions. "It's just down the road here a piece. We should be there in 10 minutes or so," a young cowboy type replied. "Thank you," Layden smiled at him warmly, instantly earning him the animosity of at least two of the male passengers. The school at Golden was about 20 miles northeast of Albuquerque. It was in the middle of nowhere as far as Neil was concerned, but he had been in nowhere before, and at least this nowhere had some trees. The school, composed of barracks similar to a military base, except there were no fences and no guards, seemed to be about the only reason for Golden to exist. There were also no cars and precious few parking lots, which had an assortment of pickups and SUVs baking in the early afternoon sunshine. The bus pulled up in front of one barracks that looked a little more prominent than the others. It also had a sign saying Administration. The bus stopped near the sidewalk, and the driver, sighing deeply, opened the door and descended to give the departing passengers access to their luggage. Heat boiled into the interior, meeting halfway the 7 persons who rose to leave the bus. To Neil's surprise, both the black woman and the ordinary-looking man from the back of the bus also got off. There was competition between Oscar and D.W. to be the first to carry Layden's luggage, and D.W. accidentally picked up one of Natalie's bags. Upon discovering his error, he hastily dropped the bag and secured the correct one. Neil noticed and laughed, looking at Natalie. "Here, let me get that for you. I seem to be the least burdened of all the passengers." "I don't need the help. I have only 2 bags, and I don't have a limp," she replied with just a little edge in her voice. "Yes, but I need the practice being a gentleman. You see, I haven't had any practice in doing so for the last 15 years, and I'm sure I've accumulated quite a bit of rust and lost a lot of hair since then," Neil replied, still grinning. "I really don't need the help." "Of course not. It would be you doing me a favor to let me carry at least one of your bags. Couldn't you take pity on an old man?" "Oh, all right," she said, finally breaking down and returning at least a part of his smile, "but only the smaller of the 2. We don't want it being a gentleman to be too much of a shock to your system." The ordinary-looking man from the back of the bus, almost without being noticed, quietly asked if he could assist the black woman with her bag. She smiled at him and accepted his courtesy with little show but a gentle smile and nod of her head. The party was strung out toward the entrance of the administration building, led by the limping Layden looking like a safari crossing the plains of Africa, with Memsahib Layden bravely leading her party of bearers and beaters to the front door of the administration building. D.W. and Oscar tied in their race to open the door for Layden. This resulted in a conflict resolved by Natalie, who had a free hand, thanks to Neil, to open the door for the rest. She and Neil shared a secret laugh at the situation, and he gallantly stayed behind to bear her company in the painfully bright sun, while the old black woman and her helper entered. Inside, the air conditioning was raising goosebumps on the exposed skin of Layden's arms, a fact that was noted carefully by Oscar and D.W. The dim lighting within, after the brightness of the sunlight, caused a general pause while sight returned to the party. "Welcome, welcome! I see we all made it this time." The greetings came from a short woman of middle age, whose personality was obviously belied by her clothing. The clothing said she was strictly professional, cool, efficient, and all business. Her voice said she was cheerful, kindly, and warm. "Are we everyone you expected?" Oscar asked, flashing his practiced smile. "Well, we were expecting 7, and you were 7. We were expecting 4 men and 3 women, and that matches. Are any of you here for some reason other than to attend our payer school?" Their demurral was enough to start the welcoming rush again. "Now, you all are just as welcome as you can be. We have a nice set of rooms just for your class. You will all be bunking in number 23, which is just down the road to the left there." She swept her arm in a quick little arc toward the white gravel road that could be seen out the window. It looked blinding, even through the tinted windows. "I'm Brenda Thompson, the chief administrator, paper pusher, and maintenance worker around here. If you have a problem here, you should tell me, because I can probably do something to help. So if you'll just come over to the desk and sign in and get your packets of welcome, we'll get you all settled and comfortable in 3 shakes of a lamb's tail." "Packets?" D.W. said. "It ain't on the computer?" "Of course it's on the computer. How do you think we printed it? But we find that people like to have it written on paper, and some of them even like to carry it around with them." She smiled. "Of course, you can just ask the computer here in the office whenever you like if you want to see the information." "Here in the office? Why not in my room?" D.W. asked in surprise. "Because there are no terminals in your rooms, nor in your barracks at all," she said with a hint of a smile, as if she expected a response. "No computers?" several of the other trainees said, clearly quite surprised. "But how will my shows? I'll miss my grandchildren." Calm down, let me explain," the now brisk administrator said in a sharp tone. With that, the group quieted, but there were still some agitated movements of hands and blinking of eyes. Neil was as surprised as the others, but perhaps for different reasons. First, he was surprised that anybody would be allowed out of the view and hearing of the central computer system. Second, he was surprised at how dependent the others in the party seemed to be on the omnipresence of the computer. First, I must point out that payers may have no luxuries at all, ever, for the rest of their lives. Living without the computer to meet your needs will bring home to you what you're giving up. Before you make your first payment, an irrevocable step from which there is no turning back, you must be certain in your own minds that you will be able to stand living without luxuries. The 6-week course of study here is as long as it is in part so you can thoroughly test your state of mind. Second, as a payer, you must be sensitive to the people around you. They are your responsibility and your rewards. You must notice them. You must hear what they say rather than what you expect to hear. You must read their body language to see if it matches their words. You must be able to empathize with all kinds of people. The computer takes your attention away from others. You depend on it to tell you what happened rather than trusting your own senses. Third, you feel watched when around a computer. This reduces your feelings of temptation when you have an opportunity to do something you would feel embarrassed for other people to know. In our situation, you will find yourself with opportunities to use and consume luxuries. If you knew the computer would observe that behavior, you would very likely restrain yourself. But with no computer, you can get away with secret consumption. No one will necessarily know if you cheat and use luxuries. We want you to find out how you will react to temptation, because you will be tempted if you become payers. Therefore, you will not have the computer available in your barracks. You will not have it available in the recreation rooms or in the cafeteria. It will be available in the classroom and here in the offices, but nowhere else. Naturally, this does not extend to your payer phone. When carrying that phone, you will have contact with the computer, but it is a limited contact. Is that clear to everyone? Nods and murmurs of agreement followed. All right, then. Get your copies of the handouts and check into your barracks. That's number 23. It's your choice of the rooms. None are very good, she finished with a grimace. They took their turns picking up the handouts and turned toward the door in a straggling column once again. Neil and Natalie were once again near the back of the column. As Neil got his papers, the administrator said to him in a quiet, though not secret way, "Please come back here as soon as you're settled. There are some things we have to go over." Neil thought, "Boy, here we go. She's going to read me the riot act." So it was a quiet and surly Neil who carried Natalie's suitcase the several hundred yards of blazing heat between the oases of the air-conditioned barracks. Since they brought up the rear, they found all the more convenient rooms were already taken, and of the 5 rooms that were left, one didn't have a functioning toilet, and another looked like the painter had stopped halfway through the job. Rejecting these impossible rooms made the resultant choice simple, if not a pleasure. Having minimal belongings, Neil found himself back in the heat and then back in the administration building within 15 minutes. He brought something of a mood with him. He was ready to bite nails and was disgusted with the whole situation. It's wonderful what 15 minutes in the New Mexico sun, without a hat, can do for your mood when it looks like your next 6 weeks will be spent living in a dump. Of course, he had spent most of the last 15 years living in an environment that was far worse, but we human beings get spoiled really fast. Once again, it took his eyes a little while to become accustomed to the dim lighting of the room, but this time he was more attentive to his surroundings. The walls were beige, with 2 windows on the front wall and 1 to each side wall. The back of the room had 2 doors, 1 to either side of the receptionist's desk. This time there was a receptionist, sort of. An old cowboy was sitting in the chair with his boots, none too clean, on a corner of the desk. His hat, which was tilted down over most of his face, had seen better days, and was sweat-stained and frayed around the edges of its highly curled brim. Neil approached the desk and cleared his throat. Nothing. "Excuse me, please?" he tried. Still no effect. Finally, his mood beginning to boil over, Neil gave the bottom boot a strong shove, forcing it to the floor with a crash as the cowboy hit the floor with the flat of both feet. It was then that Neil noticed the badge that had been concealed by a fold of the loose shirt on the slim-figured man. Well, you are something of a violent cuss, aren't you?" the deputy said, frowning. "Judge up in Santa Fe warned me that you were a little quick on the trigger. I guess she was right, mister. I don't know what's eating you, but you better get it out of your system now, or I'm going to escort you to the state line one way or another, and I'm coming back alone. You got that clear?" "Yes, sir," Neil said. Judge told me I should cut you some slack on account of you been out of the country for a time. So I'm going to tell you this once. Folks from around here don't touch strangers without asking permission first. They don't hit, shove, push, or act disrespectful. Now, you're going to go in to see Ms. Thompson. I got a lot of respect for Ms. Thompson. I won't take it kindly if I hear you didn't show her the greatest respect. Now, you get your attitude in a respectful place. You put a polite smile on your face, and you use your Sunday manners every second with her, or you may not even make it to the county line. By this time, the deputy was about 4 inches from Neil's nose, and though they were about eye to eye, Neil had the feeling that this man was able to back up his words with actions. She asked me to come and see her when I was settled in the barracks. I'm settled, so I came back. Just now, this is about the best I can do for a smile. If it isn't good enough, you better show me a place to sit and wait. Neil put on a smile that, though obviously not heartfelt, was a decent effort. Her office is there, he said, indicating the door to Neil's left. Neil nodded and said, "Thank you," with a small bow, and turned away from the deputy. He approached the door with some trepidation, squared his shoulders, and knocked. "Come in, it's open," from behind the door. Neil opened the door and stepped through. "That was quick. You got settled in good time. I hope you got a comfortable room. Please sit down." Brenda, a cheery smile on her face, had risen to her feet behind her desk and was pointing to a comfortable chair on the right of her desk. "Thank you," Neil said, and took the offered seat. "I understand you're here as part of a sentence by Judge Blake." "Yes, ma'am. They hustled me on the bus right out of the courtroom. They even had a bag of toiletries ready to give me. I guess they had a pretty good idea what was going to happen right from the beginning." "Judge Blake is usually pretty well organized," Mrs. Thompson laughed. "First off, did you get a chance to glance over those booklets to get acquainted with our campus on how we do things?" "I'm afraid not. I just dropped my bags and the handouts in my room and came right back here." Brenda nodded. "That's all right. You can look them over later. There isn't really much in them since we have very few rules here." "But you're a special case," Brenda said, sitting up straighter and leaning forward. "I understand that you're not really intending to become a payer. You're one of Judge Blake's rescue attempts. We don't mind her using us as a halfway house, but we make no attempt to give you any special treatment just because you're not really intending to become a payer." Okay, Neil thought. Maybe this won't be so bad after all. "Quote," she said in a sing-song voice, "a payer is not allowed to have money or anything money can buy," unquote. That means that you'll have to do without alcohol and nicotine and any other recreational drugs you may be taking. Coffee and tea are considered necessities for some reason, so those are permitted. A look of disdain crossed her features. Clearly, she was someone who either had never used caffeine or was a recent addict just coming off the stuff, and complete with evangelical surety enjoyed a heartfelt obligation to nag others into compliance with her new life, Neil mused. "I see that you're wearing a wristwatch that seems to be a luxury model, and your jacket's not standard issue. You'll report to the laundry and get 2 sets of yellows. One you will wear while the other is in the laundry. Each evening you will get a clean set of clothes from the laundry, and each morning you will return to the laundry the clothes worn the day before. Should your clothes become soiled, you may go to the laundry at any time and exchange them for clean clothes." "What's wrong with these clothes?" "Nothing at all. You can continue to wear them if you like. It's your choice. But the other students here all wear the yellows as part of their training. Before becoming a payer, they need to really know what it is to live without luxuries. Therefore, we have adopted the yellow standard issue clothes as a means of identifying the students from the actual payers among us. It would not do to have some non-payer use a luxury and be thought to be a payer. So you can wear what you like, but if you want to be comfortable around the other students, you should look like them at least." "Okay, that makes sense," Neil nodded. "You will eat at the mess hall. Do you have any special dietary requirements?" "No, nothing special, just lactose intolerance. I can't digest milk," Neil answered. "You'll have the infirmary available if you have any medical difficulties. A lot of our students are old enough that we often need medical treatment nearby. Do you have any medical conditions that we should inform the doctors about? They can get your records, of course, if you ask for treatment. But if there's some condition that would require special treatment or medications that they don't have on hand, we can make arrangements with the hospital in Albuquerque." "I have a bad knee, but there's nothing special that it requires. I have a prescription for malaria medication that I'll need to get filled in a couple of weeks. Usually it's no problem." "While you're here, you'll get a taste of doing without luxuries. If you can't go without them, you need to find out now before you become a payer. Once you become a payer, once you make that first payment, there is no going back. You can never again have money or luxuries for the rest of your life. There are no exceptions. You are completely identified as a payer when you make a payment, and your identity is indelibly marked in all the computers in the system on every screen of information about you. I cannot emphasize too strongly that it will do you no good to plead or say you are not in your right mind. There will be nothing anyone can do for you. The computer will not even be able to indicate that you own any luxuries, and it will not have any account for you. We do frequently lose some of the students who cannot do without cigarettes or beer or some such. Again, her mouth pursed with disapproval. To find out whether they can resist the temptation, we make alcohol and tobacco freely available in the mess hall and in the dorms. It will be there within reach whenever you are at your weakest. If you succumb to the temptation, you are the only one who needs to know. We will not check up on you and will not expel you if we find out that you're using the drugs. But you will know, and you will know that to use those luxury items after you become a payer will expose you to being ejected from the payer organization. Once ejected, you will no longer be a payer and will be branded as a failed payer on all information about you in the computer. For all anyone knows, you will be a payer who accepted a bribe. No payer will acknowledge you. You have lost any respect that you may have earned. This condition is also irrevocable. If you are found guilty of taking a bribe, you can never be a payer again unless your conviction is disproved beyond a shadow of a doubt. Proof of having consumed a luxury is all the evidence necessary to convict you. Is this point clear? Yes, ma'am, but I'm not going to become a payer. So long as you're here, everyone will treat you as if you were intending to become a payer anyway. Now, because we believe that the payers are the heart and soul of what makes our economy so successful, we make every effort to prepare each student to be an effective payer. But we cannot and do not succeed with everyone by any means. There are some who just seem to lack the personality to be a good payer. We recommend and sometimes plead with those students not to become payers. But whether to become a payer or not is their choice, and we may not make it for them, no matter that we feel their decision will be a personal tragedy for them. They must be allowed to become payers if that is their decision. Also, if they decide they don't want to make the commitment to become a payer, we don't make any attempt to change their minds. A reluctant payer cannot be a good payer. Do you understand that whether you become a payer is your choice, and no one may require that you become a payer, and no one may prevent your becoming a payer, not even a judge? I understand. The choice is mine and mine alone. Neil was becoming a little impatient with the conversation. What did she think he was, a first grader? And that it is irrevocable if you become a payer. I understand that once I am a payer, I can never return to my former status and consume luxuries. Neil nodded. Sheesh. Mr. Campbell, in your case, the judge has requested that we inform her if you consume any alcoholic beverages or if you lose your temper or both. You understand that these requirements are those of the judge and not our requirements. But we will cooperate with the judge in this matter. We will honestly report what we observe. Therefore, please be above suspicion. Do your best to avoid even the appearance of anger and avoid any mouthwash or drink that might be mistaken for alcohol. We don't want any suspicion, and we don't want to have to make any difficult decisions, because, rest assured, you will not get the benefit of any doubt. Think of yourself as having 2 strikes on you, so don't take any pitches that are close to the plate. Brenda smiled at her masculine analogy. I understand. I'll be like Caesar's wife, Neil soberly replied. Maybe this is a prison after all, he thought. Good, she said. I understand that you've been out of the country until recently, so you don't have some of the knowledge that most of our students arrive with. Therefore, I'm going to give you some material that I'd like you to read in the other room. It'll take less than a minute to read, but it's the basis of everything we do here, so give it some thought, and then come back and we'll discuss it. Shall we say 10 minutes? She took a single sheet of paper from her desk and handed it to Neil. Neil rose, thanked her, and went into the waiting room to read. Damnedest school I was ever in, Neil thought. The subject matter all on one sheet of paper? They have got to be killing me. Sighing, Neil sat down to read on one of the vinyl-covered chairs next to a reading lamp that looked like a failed high school shop project. He was relieved to see that the paper had only a few lines of writing on one side. This is what it said. The 10 principles of the new money. The computer accounts. Number 1, money exists only in the computer accounts of individual people. Number 2, only the individual owning an account can have money deducted from that account. Number 3, money cannot be transferred from one person's account to another person's account. Number 4, purchases are made by having the amount of the purchase deducted from the account of the purchaser. What money can buy? Number 5, money can buy only goods and services designated luxuries. Number 6, goods and services designated necessities are free to all as needed. The paying profession. Number 7, it is the duty of a profession, to be called here payers, to evaluate each person's actions and to pay them accordingly by increasing the amount of money in their accounts. Number 8. Only payers can increase the money in an individual's account. Number 9. All payers must be volunteers, and all volunteers must be accepted unless and until evidence of their biased or dishonest payments is produced. Number 10. Payers can never have money or luxuries for themselves, even if they stop being payers. As she had said, it took him less than a minute to read the page. These must be the 10 principles that Jean mentioned, Neil thought. Yes, there it was in number 6. Goods and services, designated necessities, are free to all as needed. It sure sounded like propaganda right out of the Communist Manifesto. Then he remembered Jean quoting this principle as his justification for moving into someone else's house without permission. It seemed that private property still existed, since in any everybody is equal system, either the house would belong to the community or everybody would have only one house. The judge certainly seemed to have little sympathy for Jean's attempt to take over the house. Wait, be systematic. What about the first principle? Money exists only in computer accounts of individuals. Yes, I understand that. That's pretty simple. I remember getting my account at the airport. I guess I have nothing to ask about that one. The second principle is only the account owner can spend the money in it. That's pretty simple, too. If it's my money, it makes sense that I'm the only one to spend it. I don't think I'll need any questions on that one either. Third is that the money can't be transferred from one account to another. That doesn't make sense. How can they put it in your account in the first place if it can't be transferred? Where does the money come from if it can't be transferred? That one she's going to have to explain. Fourth, when you spend money, it goes out of your account. That makes sense. Of course, it conflicts with number 3. Maybe she can explain that one also. Fat chance. Fifth is money can only buy luxuries. Okay, but what's a luxury? Who says what a luxury is and what it isn't? Sounds like a lot of power in the hands of whoever does. That's a definite question right there. Sixth is that communist one. Seventh is just saying that there are payers. Eighth is that only payers can put money in your account. That seems simple enough. Ninth is that anybody can be a payer and you can't force anybody to be a payer. She already went over that with a steamroller. 10th is that payers can't have luxuries no matter what for life. She pretty well rode that one into the ground as well. Okay, I'm ready. Let's see if she has any good answers. Neil rose to his feet and knocked on Brenda's door. He was soon back in the comfortable chair, and some of his attitude, the one so thoroughly squashed by the deputy, was seeping back. Do you have any questions about what that first item means? No, it seems pretty simple, Neil replied, and was about to go on when the administrator asked him a question. What does that mean for a corporation? What do you mean? Neil asked. If money can only be in the accounts of individuals, what does that mean for a corporation? Can a corporation have money? Neil paused. No, I guess they can't. What about a government? Can this country have money? Neil paused again. No, they can't either. The administrator said, Go on. Neil paused and said, No organization or group or church or family or anything can have money except individuals. He paused again. Payers can't pay an organization or a group or a business. Payers can only pay individuals. The administrator nodded. That's correct. Do you have any questions about the second principle? Neil looked down at the list again and read, Only the individual owning an account may have money removed from that account. Maybe there was more here than met the eye. Can the judge impose fines? He asked. No, she cannot. She cannot have money removed from anyone's account but her own. Can the government take any money from my account for taxes or any other reason? Neil asked. No, the government cannot have money removed from anyone's account regardless of whether they have a reason. Only the individual who owns an account may have money removed from that account. That is literally true. It means exactly what it says. That is why every time you buy something, you must explicitly tell the computer to debit your account in the amount of whatever. About the third principle. That doesn't seem possible, Neil declared, deciding to take the initiative. Money cannot be transferred from one account to another account. That seems to be a simple statement. Can you explain what you mean by saying it's impossible? Neil sat forward, his elbows on the desk, with his fingers forming a steeple, and explained. Money is no good unless it can be traded for something. Something which cannot be traded cannot be used as money. Therefore, it is impossible to have a money which cannot be transferred from one person to another. The administrator allowed a brief smile to break the even line of her lips, slightly touched with what Neil took to be a shade of burgundy gloss, and leaned back in her chair. Mr. Campbell, you have money in your account. I believe that you have used it to buy luxuries. Therefore, you have experienced what you were describing as being impossible. Step 1. You have had money placed in your account. Where did it come from? Did a payer put it there? Yes. Did that money come from somewhere else, or did the numbers in your account just get bigger? The numbers just got bigger. No other account got smaller when yours got bigger. When you spend money, the numbers in your account got smaller. No other account had its numbers get bigger just because yours got smaller. In other words, your money comes into existence when you are paid, and your money ceases to exist when you spend it. Do you agree that this is what happens? Yes, but that isn't a trade, Neil defended, warming up to the challenge of the debate. Then let's try another tack. Do you give up money when you buy something? She asked. Yes. Do you get something when you buy something? She persisted. Yes. That sure sounds like a trade to me. You give something, and you get something. Or am I missing something? She added, again with a brief smile playing across her mouth. No, but the guy who I got the thing from didn't get my money. Therefore, there was no trade. That should hold her, Neil thought to himself. I've got her on that one. Then, unbidden, and at the moment unwelcome, the image of Enid Lee flashed in front of him. He had been wiser than she was as well, correct? Who said you were trading with a guy who gave you the item you bought? Brenda countered. What was it, by the way? Neil said. I bought a car. Let's use that example. Okay. Nobody said that the trade was with the guy who gave you the car. It was a woman who gave me the car. Neil paused. No, you didn't say that the trade was with her. But then who was the trade with? It wasn't with the guys who made the car. It wasn't with the guys who brought it to the lot. It wasn't with you. So who was it with? I say there was no trade at all. Let's take these people one at a time. From your point of view as an individual, you gave up something, your money, and you got something, a car, right? Right. From the point of view of the woman who gave you the car, she gave you the car and she got paid for helping you by the payer giving her money. Therefore, she gave up something and she got something, right? Well, I assume she got paid something for that. Right. She probably got paid something for giving you the car. Now, what about whoever brought the car to the dealer? Did they give up anything? Well, they worked and they had wear and tear on their truck and they burned gas. Neil could have gone on but thought that was enough. And did they get paid for the net benefit of those actions? I guess so. What about each of the individuals who participated or contributed to the manufacture of the car? Did they each give up something? Did they each get paid for the net benefit of the consequences of their actions? Okay, I get your point. Each person involved in this whole affair both gave something and got something. So what? I didn't trade with any of them. Neil felt triumphant. Her whole case was falling apart. Mr. Campbell is a trade and exchange. She just would not give up and admit he was right. Of course. When all those people who got money for helping benefit you with a car spend their money, well, a lot of goods and services have been exchanged. They will have been given to other people but not exchanged. In no case are two people exchanging items. Neil was shaken a little but still felt he had the better of the argument. Mr. Campbell, what you are describing as exchange is called barter. There is no money, no medium of exchange involved in barter. When you use money, even a palm, you are not directly exchanging items, but are using a medium so that you don't have to directly exchange item for item with other people. When you use a palm, you may, under some circumstances, actually give up a physical object such as the currency form of that money. But the person you're giving it to only values it because it can be traded in turn, not for its inherent usefulness, such as was the case before the transition. Speaking of which, at one time, all money was commodity money. Then the money itself had value to the individuals in and of itself. But few monies have been of value in and of themselves for the last 100 years in any economy I can think of. The essence of what money is comes from its being a medium of exchange. Money makes it easier for people to exchange goods and services. In many ways, it's just another kind of accounting system. Neil considered something, started to speak, hesitated, and then said, So what you are saying is that because people want this account money, they give goods and services to each other, and that is the exchange. Yes, Mr. Campbell, the money in those accounts serves as a medium by which goods and services are exchanged. This is true even though the money in these accounts is never transferred from one account to another, even though the computer program will not allow money to be transferred from one account to another. Do you understand what that means? As Neil thought of the implications, they seemed to multiply, tumbling one over the other in a multi-dimensional kaleidoscope of relationships until he had to order them in his mind. It means, for starters, that you can't give your money to anyone else. It means no one can take your money even by force. After all, what is there to take? It means that you cannot loan money to someone else. It means that there is no insurance, since there is no way one can pay a claim. I guess maybe it also means that when you buy something, no one has a reason to cheat you. Of course, that last one is a little tenuous, I suppose. Ready for the fourth principle? Brenda asked, her voice prying into his reverie. Fourth? Okay, this one seems the most obvious to me, Neil said. Yes, it is mostly just a description of the mechanics of how money is spent. What about the fifth principle? Here we describe what money can buy. Glad you asked, because I have a lot of questions on this one. First off, who's to say what is a luxury and what is not a luxury? I should think that would vary from individual to individual. What's a luxury to one person would be called a necessity by another. That seemed obvious to Neil, and he thought it was the strongest objection yet to the system, and so naturally he thought it should be obvious to everyone else. You're quite right, Brenda responded, continuing. That which is a luxury to one person may seem a necessity to some other persons. But what has that to do with the fifth principle? Hold on a second. What do you mean, what does it have to do with it? Read it yourself. It says that money can only buy goods and services that are luxuries. No, it says which are designated luxuries, which is altogether different. I can designate anything as a luxury. It doesn't have to actually be a luxury in reality. Neil was a little disgusted and, truth be known, slightly let down at this seemingly feeble turn in the debate. So all this says is that money can buy anything, since anything can be designated as a luxury. Not quite. What it says is that money should be able to buy only some things, not everything, Brenda emphasized with a slight arching of her neatly plucked auburn eyebrow. Now, it does not say what should be included as things that money can buy. It also doesn't say how the decision should be made, that is, which people or what group or what individual should make that decision. Given that some group has to make those decisions, it does not say how that group should reach a decision. It is left completely up to those who implement such a form of money. Well, that answers my next question, too, then. I was going to ask who decides, Neil laughed. Oh, we let the payers decide, she said. The payers? Something about that simple answer struck Neil as logically dubious. Begging your pardon, Ms. Thompson, but isn't that like asking the fox to guard the hen house? I mean, why wouldn't they just make everything necessity so that they can have everything for free? Oh, no, if they did that, then money wouldn't be able to buy anything, and the payers would have no power to influence anything. No one would care about the payers. The payers want the desire for money to be a powerful motivation for people. The more powerful that motivation, the more important payers are to the people who work to produce everything. Therefore, they are more motivated than anyone else to have as many things as possible be luxuries. She stopped for a moment, as if this point was a regular one for newcomers to ponder, and walked to the window, staring toward the distant hills shimmering in the convection mirage of the heat. There's a certain balance there, don't you think? She continued, noticing that Neil seemed more reflective than puzzled or panicked, the two major reactions to this point. On the one hand, payers want more things to be necessities so they can have them, but on the other hand, they want fewer things to be necessities so that they'll feel more powerful. A self-correcting balance, don't you think? I guess that you'll give me a similar answer if I ask about the sixth principle, Neil said. Similar in some ways, she said. The principles don't specify how we're to designate necessities. Also, as you mentioned in regard to luxuries, what seems a necessity to one person may not seem necessary at all to someone else. But then we can designate anything as a necessity, whether it's actually necessary or not. And yes, we do let the payers make that decision for us, and for the same reason as before, a balance of opposing forces that should prevent extremes in either direction. She paused for a moment, cast what seemed to Neil to be a wistful glance toward the hills, and said, Any more questions about the sixth principle? Neil thought of Jean and decided to go ahead, though the particular language was not to his liking. This principle is clearly communistic, he said with a rise to his voice, approaching an accusatory tone. How do you justify that? If the charge bothered her one whit, Brenda didn't let on to that effect. Okay, she began, her elbow on the windowsill and her body facing him at an angle that made Neil reevaluate his earlier impression of average looks. You had better tell me what you mean by communist so I can understand your comment, she said, clicking the index fingers of both hands in an act of forming parentheses. Neil hadn't seen that one in years. You know, he began, searching his memory from his foreign service training for the verbatim expression, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, that sort of thing. The last he added as a tribute to Darren in his endearingly stereotypical English manner. Pure communism. Seemingly amused at this somewhat unexpected turn of the topic from the decision she had made about Neil, layabout, surly, argumentative, Brenda began her argument as she sat down opposite him in one of the comfortable chairs on Neil's side of the desk. Shall we start with socialism, then? She asked. You can start with anything you like, but you're going to eventually end up admitting it's communistic. We shall see. Socialism is government ownership and control of the means of production, correct? Her tone was even and objective, neither threatening nor encouraging. Close enough, Neil replied. You've been in this country for over a month now. Have you seen any government ownership or control? Have you even seen any government other than the police? Anywhere? Neil reflected for a moment and then realized that he was stalling for time, as he knew the answer intuitively as soon as she had put the question to him. There was no representative of government at either of the places he had worked. There were no rules that he knew of which had come down from the government. There certainly were no government guys there checking to see if they were following the rules. Hell, he couldn't even remember anyone bitching about the government, which had been a favorite topic of pointless griping when he had left the States. Of course, there were payers around from time to time, but that wasn't government if he was following Brenda's train of thought. Okay, he responded, slightly irritated at the fact that he was unable to successfully suppress the silly grin that moved across his face. I agree that I have not seen any government control, and all the property I have known of was not owned by any government. So can we rule out socialism for our society? Yes, agreed, not socialist. The communist nations of the 20th century were all socialist, so though they called themselves communist, they were really socialist, right? What I mean is they used the term communism to personalize their form of state socialism. Would you agree? Yeah, sure, he allowed. They lied about a lot of other things, too, Neil said. Sure as hell lied about other things, he thought, half hoping they might continue this skewering of the Eastern Nations group, one of his favorite whipping boys for obvious reasons. But she was already moving on. Okay, but on to communism, she began. In a commune, by definition, most things are owned in common. Have you seen any property that was owned in common since you've been in this country, she asked, eyebrows raised. Neil again lingered on the pretty auburn glint off her eyebrows and then rejoined the conversation. No, okay, but how could I tell? For one thing, you'll notice that when you buy something, all the money comes out of your account. How could the computer register the ownership of something which you only own half of? Which half would be owned by which person? Just like there cannot be joint accounts, there cannot be joint ownership. Therefore, no property is owned in common. Therefore, no communes. Now she was sounding like a lecturer, and Neil immediately wanted the warmer Brenda back, the one who had had him thinking of her, but most definitely not in the role of lecturer. She continued, Mr. Campbell, how does a communist state acquire the goods it gives to all? What motivates the producers of those goods to work? If they don't work, they're jailed or shot. That seems like ample motivation to me, Neil added, with more than a healthy dose of sarcasm. It occurred to him that Brenda would have only minimal knowledge of his past, whatever was in the envelope from the court, and that he might get to explain it in depth more casually if... What motivated the people who gave you food? Sorry, say again? He hoped that she had not been able to somehow divine what he was thinking. He didn't know how, but damned if some women couldn't do it. What motivated the people who gave you food? They'd get paid for it. All right. Would somebody shoot them or put them in jail if they didn't give you food or a place to live? No. Neil was beginning to feel trapped. In a free market economy, say, what is the motivation of those who work? They want to trade what they produce for other things. What was your motivation for working this last couple of months? Neil was almost squirming. I wanted to better myself. I like being usefully employed. Was anybody forcing you to work? Was anybody forcing you to give your property to someone in need? No. Then in what sense is the economy you've been living in communistic? I'm afraid I don't understand, she added, almost gratuitously, it seemed to Neil. None, I guess. Mr. Campbell, my point here is not to make you admit that you're wrong. It's to point out to you that there are all sorts of ways to be sure everybody gets whatever they need to live, in the sense we've been discussing these last few minutes. The way we've chosen is to pay anybody who gives someone else what they need. It doesn't matter whether we call what is given a luxury, a necessity, or what have you. The payers pay for the consequences of the action, not the morality or virtue of the action. If you need food and someone gives you food, they get paid. We don't have to force anyone to do this, since there's almost always someone at hand willing to do it for the money. Okay, so it's not communistic or socialistic. It still sounds like welfare to me. And speaking of me, Neil thought, when is she going to call me Neil and leave that Mr. Campbell behind? Probably when I call her Brenda and not Mrs. Thompson. But something told him, not just yet. You may call it what you will, she said, as if she had once again been reading his mind. Now, let's get to the part that is important for us here at the school, shall we, Neil? He could only look at her and hope that he didn't look as surprised as he felt. Invisible Hand, Chapter 29, Dorm Life, in which Neil finishes in the office, gets his books, and learns more about what happened while he was away. Neil was feeling less certain that the apparently simple statements were really as simple as they appeared. They seemed to have consequences that would never have occurred to him. This payer principle was the longest of the 10, so there was bound to be something here that was not what it seemed. It was the time to tread warily. Neil cautiously began. The key word in this principle seems to be evaluate. The payers evaluate each person's work and pay them according to the value of that work. What does value mean in this context? Brenda smiled as if pleased with his question. You do understand that value is in the eye of the beholder. Each individual evaluates things for himself. There is no sense in which one person can be said to correctly know the value of anything for some other person. That is, if I think I know the value of something to you, I am almost certainly wrong. Only you can know what value you place on some object or service, and that value can and will change over time. Are we agreed on that? Oh yes, that's pretty obvious, Neil nodded in agreement. So let's consider how prices are set in a free market. The price of an item can and will vary over time. Each trade in which that item is bought contributes to what is thought of as the price of that item, Brenda said, making the quotes with her fingers. But each individual trade shows only some aspect of what one individual thought the item was worth to him. It only shows that the individual was willing to pay at least as much as he did pay. He may well have been willing to pay more. Therefore, the going market rate, or price, more fingers, is not an accurate or true measure of the value that any individual places on the item either. Yet the free market works quite well, and the individuals who participate in that market are able to pursue and achieve, sometimes at least, their ends. But so far all you have said is that the actual value is unknowable. Yes, Brenda nodded vigorously, her smile broadening. I think it probably is unknowable. But useful prices are being set. Evaluations are being made in the free market. And in the same way, payers are evaluating. They are setting prices on various kinds of benefit. Some payers may pay a little more and some a little less for specific benefits, but rarely is there a great discrepancy between two payers, just as there is rarely a great difference in the prices paid for specific items in the free market. Therefore, the word evaluate in this principle is only referring to that assigning of a specific amount of pay. It does not in any way represent some sort of measure of true value or value to some individual. For example, if a doctor is paid $500 for saving someone's life in an operation, what does that have to do with the true or actual value of the doctor's action? To the individual whose life is saved, the act is probably worth a lot more than $500. For someone else who doesn't know the person who is saved, it might not be worth anything. Right after talking about the free market, you said, in the same way payers are setting prices. What did you mean by that? Neil asked. The payers actually constitute a free market for people who work. But that's taken up in some depth in your classes, so I'd rather not get into that just now. I'm sure you'll have a full treatment of it before long. All right, then. How about Principle 8? Only payers can increase the money in an account. Didn't we already get that one in one of the early principles? No, she said. That's just the closing of the circle, so to speak. We talked about how money can be removed from an account, and this shows how money can appear in an account. Do you have any questions about it? No, but I do have questions about the 9th principle. It says that all payers must be volunteers. Why do they have to be volunteers? What kind of payers would they be if they didn't want to be payers at all? Why do you think we go to such pains here to weed out those who wouldn't like being payers? But most fundamentally of all, to force someone to be a payer would be a form of slavery, especially when you consider the 10th principle. Oh yes, I can see that. But the 9th principle also says that all volunteers must be accepted. Doesn't that mean that you might get a lot of bad payers? She smiled. From your question, one would think that being a payer was a wonderful thing, and that we have thousands of people demanding to become payers beating on our doors. Most people don't want to be payers. This is good because we only need about 3 to 5% of the adult population to be payers. Second, wanting to be a payer is the most important characteristic in a good payer. Unless one likes that life, one will not be able to do it really well. Most important, though, she continued, is that it gives everybody the opportunity to put their money where their mouth is in an almost literal sense. If you don't like the way payers are paying, then become a payer and do it yourself. Back before the transition, we used to have all sorts of talk about discrimination and affirmative action and glass ceilings and whatnot. Now you hardly ever hear of that sort of thing. For one reason, it reduces your pay to discriminate on any basis except performance. For another, there are many payers of every ethnic and racial group that I ever heard of. If you don't like what one payer is paying, change location, change the work you do, or wait a while and the next payer will probably pay better. We do get some bad payers. After all, payers are just people. They're not saints and they don't have godlike powers. Some are definitely biased. There have been some scandals among the payers, but oddly enough, they mostly do get better, or violate their vows and are kicked out, or judge some work that doesn't let their bias show. The payers control each other because their reputation as a group is very important to them. Okay, I'm sure you're glad that we've reached the last principle, Neil smiled. Payers can't ever have luxuries or money. Now I have to ask why anyone would want to be a payer. Yes, she smiled back. That is the companion question to why we let everybody who wants to become a payer. The basic reason, I think, is that everyone wants to feel important to other people. We all want to think that others respect us and like us. Since payers can give you money, everybody pays attention to them. Everybody notices what they do. So long as things are going well, we like the payers in general. Also, payers do make very important decisions. They really are important to everyone's success and happiness. That's a form of power which is very attractive to some people. Another motive is that some people want to do good things for others. Payers can motivate other people to do good things. It might make a grandmother feel good to reward a mother for taking good care of her children, for example. In a few cases, people have wanted to become payers to defend their group from being discriminated against by others. In that way, they could be sure their group would not be underpaid. One of the most important reasons for many men is that they can no longer do their former work, but don't want to just sit home all day. As payers, they can still be involved in a meaningful way. There are as many motivations as there are payers, I guess. No two are the same, but they also are not completely different. Why can't payers have luxuries? Neil persisted. That seems unfair to make them give up things that they may have worked hard for. He was picturing what his own life would be like without the luxuries he enjoyed. Payers must have the trust of the people who work. Otherwise, those people will ignore or, even worse, attack the payers. One of the most valuable things a payer has in his favor is a reputation for being fair and unbiased. How would it look for a payer to have an expensive car? It would look like he'd accepted a bribe. Or how about if all the payers lived in the expensive part of town and never went to the poorer sections? It would mean that they were separated from the very people who have the least power and can least defend themselves from those with power. But these reasons pale beside the most important reason. If payers can never have luxuries, then it's easy to tell if they've accepted a bribe. Anyone who observes a payer consuming a luxury knows that that payer has been bribed. There is no other way other than theft that the payer could have acquired the luxury. The ease of detection not only keeps the payers from temptation, it also gives the people who work confidence that those who pay them are not corrupt. If payers could have money, that would mean they were paying each other, or worse, themselves. If they could pay each other and have luxuries, I think you can see what would happen. They'd be completely out of control. As it is, payers must live among the people at the bottom of the social pyramid. Since they live at the bottom, everyone else is at least as well off as they are. Thus, payers have a powerful motive to raise the quality of life at the bottom. The poor can serve the same function for society that canaries served in the mines. Just as birds would faint from poisonous gases before the miners did, and thereby give them warning that there was poison gas in the air, so does the condition of the poor indicate when things are going wrong in the economy. With the payers right there and with the power they have, such problems are addressed quite quickly. But why can't they have money or luxuries after they can no longer pay? That seems a cruel thing to do to them after years of service. That restriction prevents deferred bribes. I'll give you luxuries later if you'll pay me now. This provision is to prevent suspicion. As a practical matter, when a person is too old to pay, there aren't many luxuries left that one can easily consume anyway. When I was sent here by the judge, I rode on a bus that had decorations like I've never seen before. It was like a Wild West saloon in there. One of the other passengers told me that it cost the driver over $10,000 to decorate it that way. But that means that such decorations were a luxury. But we had some payers riding in that bus. Weren't they consuming a luxury, and shouldn't they have been disbarred or whatever it is you do to cheating payers? What did it cost you to ride that bus? Nothing. So the ride was a necessity? I think, given my sentence, it certainly was for me, Neil grinned. Were any of the other riders asked to pay to ride? Not that I could tell. It looked like it was free to all, as your item 6 says. If a person has some luxury which is made freely available to others and which the person does not have to give up in order to make it freely available, they may share it with any and everybody without penalty. It isn't a luxury for those other people. They don't have to pay for it. If you sing on the street, for example, anyone may hear you. But if you sing in the theater, you can charge money to people to hear you perform, and that makes your singing a luxury. On the other hand, if you had a box of chocolates and were handing those out, a payer should not take any because what they take someone else could not have. That is, they would be reducing what was available to others. If there had been other passengers who wanted to ride your bus, the payers would have left the bus and given their places to those passengers. The reason being that the resource would have become scarce. Do you follow the reasoning? Neil nodded, and there was a pause. Finally he said, I can't think of anything more to ask right now. Don't worry, you'll think of plenty more later in class, but I think that for now you understand well enough to not be lost in class. In fact, I think you'll do rather well. Your experience abroad seems to have given you a flexibility of mind that many others lack. She stood and shook hands with Neil and wished him well in his studies, and more importantly, in not yielding to the temptation to drink or lose his temper. Neil went to the bookstore to pick up his textbooks. He grinned at the thought of how Sam, from the Frobisher Mall back in Virginia, would have approved of his having actual paper texts. On the way there, he heard a clock chime 3 o'clock, or more likely a recording of a clock on a loudspeaker, and in a minute or two people began coming out of some of the barracks. It must be class change. Boy, it's like being back in high school, Neil thought. Then he noticed that almost everyone he saw leaving the buildings was wearing yellow outfits. They were cut along the same lines as the standard issue whites, but just a different color. For a moment it struck him as being odd, but then he remembered payers can never have money or luxuries for themselves, even if they stop being payers, and remembered that it was part of the program to give them a taste of what it was like being a payer. He also noticed that almost everyone was old. In fact, he was about the youngest person he could see. Brenda had been only about 35, he guessed, and a deputy was about 45, but these people were almost all obviously over 60. It seemed strange at first, but then he remembered that most of the payers he had seen were also over 60. He guessed that it would be much harder to give up luxuries for the young. The thought that each of these people were giving up much of what made life pleasurable in exchange for something quite intangible gave Neil pause. The sincerity of these people was unquestionable. Acquiring the status of payer must be very important to them. Was there anything so important to Neil that he'd give up everything he'd worked for since he was a youth, other than the lives and health of his immediate relatives? He could think of nothing. The bookstore was almost deserted. Since very few of its customers could buy luxuries, there weren't many people needed at the bookstore. As a result, he was waited on by an old woman in whites. She eyed him somewhat suspiciously because he was wearing neither yellows nor whites. What do you want these texts for? Neil handed over the sheet of stationery from the administrative office on which the list of his books was written. By good fortune, the letter had the administrator's signature on it and indicated that Neil was a student at the school. Getting a pretty late start, aren't you, son? The rest of your class has already been in here and gone. Yes, ma'am, but better late than never. You're right there, sonny. I was over 60 before I found what I wanted to do. At least you're getting an early start on paying. Rather than get involved in an explanation that would reveal his sordid past, Neil let her believe that he was just another payer to be in training. Arriving at his home for the next 6 weeks, Neil was disappointed to see just how small the room was and how spartan the furnishings. There was one single bed, a bookcase, a desk with chair, a rod across one corner of the room with a few wire coat hangers, and some sheets and blankets folded on the mattress. The single other door in the room was for the bathroom. It, at least, had a good bathtub with railings to hold while entering. He remembered jail and thought that it was more accommodating in some ways. Well, they told him that one of the points of this place was to let one know what it was like to live without any luxuries at all. He figured that wherever a pair went after this place would seem like a luxury indeed. As Neil changed into his new yellow standard issue clothes, he wondered what he could do to entertain himself. There was no TV, of course. What was he going to do after class? There were his textbooks, but they didn't promise to be exciting reading. Already bored with the room and the view of another barracks building out the single window, Neil went back into the hallway and along it to the lobby-like area near the front door. There were quite a few comfortable places to sit, and most of the seats were taken. Neil recognized them all, of course, but couldn't remember several of the names. They seemed deep in a discussion of the transition which Neil had missed completely. He slowly walked closer and took an unoccupied seat quite near, but not really part of, the circle involved in that discussion. But they had to do something like that, otherwise all the owners of stocks and bonds would have lost all their money, D.W. was saying. I have no quarrel with the stockholders getting dollar for dollar. What I don't like is that people who were running the companies were given ownership of them. Layden, whose name Neil remembered quite easily, replied, "That doesn't seem fair to me. My cousin knows a man who had been practically gutting a company before the transition who got ownership of I don't know how many millions of dollars worth of capital equipment. You know, generators and trucks and things, just because he was the chairman of the board when the transition happened." "So who would you have had assume ownership of the capital? Some random guy off the streets?" Oscar said. "No, I think the capital should have been given to the workers," Layden shot back. "That's just the old socialist dream of the workers ruling the world," the quiet man who had helped the black woman with her bags countered. "That would never have worked, because each worker would have gotten a different piece of equipment or several small things, and none of them would have been satisfied." "It could have worked," Layden said. "The workers could have voted on what to do with the goods." "Yeah, right. I'm sure they would have agreed on everything. You would have had one argument after another. It would have been chaos," DW said. The quiet man said, "I think it was just another way for the rich to keep their advantages. They had all those lobbyists working on Congress. They thought they were going to lose everything, and that was how they thought they could save themselves and keep their undeserved wealth," Oscar replied. "But if you gave the capital to the workers, how would you have decided which worker got what? You'll remember that Congress was adamant about no collective ownership," Layden said. "I never understood why they did that. Seems to me that all the public property the government had was collectively owned all along." Natalie said, "Collective responsibility is no responsibility at all." Then she added, "You should hear that repeated over and over in class. Each individual must be responsible for his own actions. You can't get credit or blame for what some other adult does or fails to do." Layden shot back, "Then how can we pay a person who makes capital goods when somebody else uses those goods well? Isn't that paying one adult for the actions of another adult?" "No, that's paying people who are working together for the results of their joint efforts," the quiet man said, "even though the work they each do is at different times and places." Neil was beginning to think that he had better come up with some other way to think of him, since he seemed to be holding his own in the conversation. "Yeah," said DW, "collective isn't the same at all. If it were collective, the guy who uses the tool the other man made would get paid for all the tools the guy made. The credit would have to flow both ways." "What? That makes no sense at all. What do you mean?" Oscar asked. "Say a group of people are a collective," DW began, happy for a chance to defeat Oscar in verbal combat in front of the beautiful lady. "If person A makes a tool and person B uses it, then the whole group gets the credit. So person C would get paid for person B using the tool and person A making the tool. So if a person A made 10 tools and person B, who used only one of those tools, would get paid for the use being made by the other 9, they would all be paid the same. Don't you see? Besides, the CEOs of those companies were then responsible for the use made of their capital goods. If they did nothing useful with them, then they lost a lot of potential income," Natalie said. Neil addressed the group. "I was out of the country when all this happened. Why did they change the money anyway?" They all started to answer, then stopped, laughed, and turned to Oscar. "Why don't you start, Oscar?" Layden said, and earned a glower from DW. "Okay, Layden. You know about the wars of the Middle East and about the oil price rise, don't you, Neil?" "Oh, I'm Neil Campbell. I'm afraid I've forgotten some of your names, and I don't think I ever heard others." "I'm Clayton Fielding," the formerly quiet man said. "I'm Natalie." "You," I remembered, Neil smiled at her. "I'm Wendy," the black woman said. "And you're Oscar, and you're DW, Neil looking at each of the men. "Okay, yes, I know more than I care to remember about the oil wars, but I wasn't paying much attention when the oil prices were raised." "Okay, I'll start there. About 2010, things came to a head in what was Iran and Iraq. Civil and religious wars had everybody afraid of everybody else and nobody wanting to let the other guy sell any oil. There were all sorts of terrorist attacks on the oil fields, the pumping stations, the storage tanks, and the ships that were in or near the ports. The problem also spread to other Islamic oil producers, who naturally blamed the Christian West in general and the U.S. in particular. When the U.S. and the UN tried to put a lid on things to maintain their oil supplies using military force, the other nations started an oil embargo. This didn't stop all the world's oil flow by any means, but it did reduce the supply enough that the prices went through the roof. Inflation became rampant, and the huge debts that the U.S. had incurred to pay for their military adventures had to be expanded enormously to pay for oil, and the rest of the industrialized world wouldn't invest in our bonds since they had problems just as bad or worse than ours. Well, what with one thing and another, just what things are important that I won't say since that will just start an argument, we got huge inflation and huge unemployment. There were socialists, communists, libertarians, anarchists, gold standard folks, and whatnot. It began to look like we were going to follow in the footsteps of Russia in 1917 or Germany in 1933 and end up with some kind of dictatorship. There were armed mobs in the streets in some towns. But then, in what was almost a miracle, this crackpot theory started to spread on the internet. It offered a solution not only to the immediate economic problems we were facing, but to the problem of preventing their return. Oscar was in his element. He was preaching, even though it wasn't religion. Before you knew what was happening, it seemed like everybody was talking about the problems that physical object money caused and how it was silly to use antique money in the modern world. They were pointing out to one another that so-and-so wouldn't be a problem with the new money. Other people were volunteering to be payers. Even some prison in Alabama volunteered to test the idea on its prisoners. The elections of 2010 were in midstream, and suddenly lots of the candidates were promising to try this solution. Now, I figured that none of them thought it would work and we would have to back out of it, but that it would get them elected and eliminate this problem of inflation and the international debt for the time being. They figured that we would never get enough people to be payers. But they were wrong. There were so many old folks who were hanging on for dear life with the inflation wiping out their pensions, and the prospect of never having to worry about food, housing, and medical care again sparked a flood of volunteers. Most of them said things like, "I ain't got nothing you could call a luxury now, so I got nothing to lose becoming a payer, and at least I'll eat." I don't think they really understood at first what it meant to be a payer. That's why they started these schools, to let them know what it was going to be like. A lot of volunteers never actually became payers, but there were enough who did that we got by easily. In any event, the new Congress got together and everything was coming apart in the economy, so they passed the new money law and said it would take effect in 2 years. They promised that all the debts would be paid by goods when the conversion took place. The international debt was to be settled after the transition, and all we had to do was hang on until then. People who owned stock were promised dollar for dollar the market value of their stock at the time of the conversion. People who owned property could keep it without paying taxes or give it to somebody who would use it and get a continuing income. And us old folks would not have to worry about medical bills or inflation eating our pensions, or not having anyone to take care of us when we could not take care of ourselves. It seemed to give just about everybody hope, and we were able to last the 2 years, barely. The foreign nations were afraid we were going to refuse to pay our debts, especially the oil-producing nations. They threatened to cut off our oil supply if we went through with it. We did, and they did. But we fooled them. We didn't collapse. Everybody pulled together like we hadn't done since World War II. Within 2 years, we were producing more oil than we needed and were offering to trade oil to our former debtors for what we owed them. Since the price of oil abroad was still very high, we did all right. Anyway, that's why we changed the money. It was sort of a national hysteria. There are still some people right here in the U.S. who don't think it'll work, but they're considered the lunatic fringe now. I even think the rest of the world is beginning to wake up to the fact that what we have here works. And we payers are the ones who make it work, Wendy said proudly. You aren't a payer yet, Wendy, any more than the rest of us are, Layton said. But I will be. Just you wait and see. I'm going to do it right, and I'll be one of the best. Go for it, Wendy, Oscar said, patting her on the back. Lead us on. Niall spent the rest of the evening, until bedtime, asking questions and getting answers about all sorts of things. He especially asked about the computer setup, but none of them knew particulars, just that they started with these really cheap little TVs which were connected to the internet and had little computers which could identify voices and fingerprints. They put them in all the stores that were selling luxuries, and in a couple of years they were replaced with ones that could also recognize faces and retinal patterns, and still later in the really expensive stores they did a DNA match and scent analysis. The home TV sort of came along with that. They became the universal interface with the outside world. They provided entertainment, telephone, internet access, smoke and fire alarms, intruder warning, thermostatic controls, and they kept track of your medical condition as well for some problems. People had started personalizing them pretty early on, and almost everybody had a name for their TV, and the TV started having personality as well. Just as Neil had Jeeves, so many of the others had servants or friends or even pets in their TVs. Neil discovered that Jeeves was one of the more common personalities. That explained why the TV had adopted so complete a persona so quickly. No one seemed to question why the TV computers should be in every home with access to private information about all who were near it. Neil figured that the average payer had no more idea what the real purpose of those TVs was than the average citizen. They were just something that was part of everyday life. The conspiracy was still hidden. At least there were no obvious computers in the barracks. One never knew, of course. Invisible Hand, Chapter 30, Return of Jean, in which Neil and Jean are together again, and Neil discovers a new lead on what might be behind the computers and where. For a student, the day is organized around the class schedule. Neil had several classes, each with a different subject. He learned, he disputed, he came to terms with that which seemed silly when he first heard it. But he began to understand. Neil was studying all these subjects mixed together. He would get a little here and a little there. After classes and the evening meal, the students gathered in the lounge and discussed what they were learning in the class. For some, it was old hat common knowledge in the groups in which they lived before they came to the school. For others, it was their first contact with the rationale behind their economy. Sometimes the conversations were almost like tutoring. In other cases, the discussions were almost bitter political debate over deeply held beliefs. But in every group, the topic was always how the new money worked, how it functioned, how it provided the medium of exchange for the society, its consequences, and most of all, paying. Part of the reason for this was that there was no other entertainment. There was no entertainment TV, no movies, no radio, no plays, no parties. No one wanted to be seen drinking or smoking, since that would indicate failure. If one stayed with the others and got involved in conversation, it was easier to avoid thinking about what one did not have. They were all here, with a few notable exceptions, to become payers. This was a major change in their lives, so they thought a lot about paying. Since they shared all these characteristics, regardless of their other differences, there was no one who wanted to change the general subject of the conversations. The outside world, which they were preparing to influence by their decisions, was lost to them for this timeless time, since their contact with it via the ubiquitous TVs and news media was cut off. In this tiny world in which all the other people accepted what Neil could only doubt, he naturally felt a pressure to conform to their way of thinking. There were only two possible reactions in such a situation. He could change to think as they did, or he could rebel and reject everything they stood for. Neil was still not completely over his traumatic experiences of the last 15 years, and the paranoia that would have been debilitating to most people had they not had access to the healing drugs was still present in his psyche, though to a very small degree. Neil rebelled. He did not become violent. He didn't appear to lose his temper, but he did refuse to accept as valid what the other students believed so easily. Neil was able to find interpretations of his experiences that denied the validity of what he was being taught. Many of his arguments with his instructors took place in his mind. He would not allow others to know the intensity of his disagreement, that is, until he found a friend. It was 11 days after Neil's arrival that one Jean Baudin descended from a bus in front of the administration building with a disgusted look on his face. One of the first people he saw was Neil walking between classes. Here was a possible ally against a most unreasonable world. At the least, it was someone who might know a few angles to take advantage of. But Neil was hurrying away without having seen Jean, so Jean had to put off the reunion. But by some not-so-subtle questioning, Jean was able to discover the barracks where Neil lived and managed to happen to run into him at the cafeteria. Neil was glad to see Jean because Jean had been an ally when they were in jail. He knew that Jean disagreed with the general way people looked at things in these parts. "Do you know what that crazy judge did?" Jean sputtered when Neil asked what he was doing in payer school. "She told me that I had a choice of banishment or coming to payer school to learn how things work around here. I had something of the same alternatives given me, except that I also had the choice of wearing a collar that would drug me to keep me calm and probably to serve as a warning to others that I was psycho," Neil laughed. "How does she get away with giving sentences like that?" Jean wondered. "I've been before judges in several countries, and they hit you with a fine or some days in jail, but that's it. There's none of this giving you a choice of sentences in exile, for goodness sakes. They haven't done exile in 200 years. "Oh, they explained that in one of my courses," Neil said. "History, I think it was. When judges couldn't use fines anymore because nobody can take money out of your account except you, they started to have to use other means of punishment. The payers were paying for consequences, and keeping a person in jail who isn't dangerous is expensive for the judge who keeps him there. Then, too, the number of crimes and criminals dropped to very low levels, and there were no more lawsuits, so there was a lot more time for the judges to consider what would be the best thing to do in each case. As if that weren't enough, some people started setting themselves up as judges without having any connection with the state or local government. People who wanted a judgment would agree on a judge, state their cases before whoever they had agreed on, and accept the determination of the judge. Those who went back on their agreement to abide by what the judge decided had that added to their reputation in a declaration. It wasn't long before people found that it didn't matter much whether the judges were official or not. "What does all that have to do with anything?" Jean interrupted. "This judge is still crazy." "No, really. The only judges who could get cases were those who were impartial and treated everybody fairly, because both parties had to agree on who the judge would be. The best would find solutions that made both parties happy." "Well, that stupid judge we got sure didn't make me happy. If I had known what the sentence would be, I'd have demanded another judge. But that attorney I got, they must have some sort of sweet swindle going, where the attorney recommends the judge and then gets a kickback. He told me she was the best in the state." "At least you aren't doing jail time," Neil said soothingly. "I think the whole setup is a conspiracy. They have to be making money off this thing somehow," Jean maintained stoutly. "Okay, so there's a conspiracy. I haven't been able to spot it. Every time I think I have it figured out, there's some twist, and I realize that that isn't it. Have you got any idea how they're pulling it off?" He wasn't expecting Jean to really know, but Neil had been without someone to confide in for a long time, and the temptation slipped up on him without his realizing it. He was also no longer so conscious of the computer hearing and seeing everything as before, since the computer was only part of his life in class. Naturally, he suspected that there were hidden cameras and microphones, and who knew what else in the barracks. But since they were not obvious and no one acted as if they were observed, he stopped being conscious of its presence. "I'll tell you what I think," Jean said in a low conspiratorial voice. "I think these payers, they got all over the place or what's doing it. I think they got something up their sleeves. I know some of these guys around here are sincere and really are giving up luxuries and all that, but I'll bet there are a bunch of payers that have all the luxuries they want. I think those guys are the ones that are in control. What do you bet that there are some payers that can pay themselves? They can go around looking like rich guys, and then in secret they pay themselves as much as they want." Neil said, "I thought of that, but how do they fool the computer?" "They don't have to fool a computer. They control a computer. It does just what they tell it to," Jean maintained. "These courses they teach here are for those suckers who will do the work for the secret guys. Just because they tell you there's no way to both pay and get paid, don't you believe it." Okay, so what do we do about it?" Neil asked. "Why should we do anything about it?" Jean asked, surprised. "They got it made. I just want to get in on the good deal. I figure that if I can figure out how they control the computer, they won't miss a few $1 million. "Do you think the secret's to be found here?" Neil asked. "Nah, this place is for suckers. I think the payers who can pay themselves have to have some place where they can hide out to enjoy their luxuries. They have to have some place where regular folks don't go, and they'd have to defend their hideouts from people who just wandered by." Jean paused and looked at Neil expectantly. Neil looked back and raised his shoulders in a shrug. "The palm colonies, man, it's obvious," Jean finally continued. "Remember how they ran out all the payers when they took over? They claimed to have bought all the land around those towns, but I bet they got rid of the folks that objected." "Palm colonies? What are they?" Neil asked. This was something they hadn't covered in any of his classes. "The way they tell it," said Jean, "there were a few folks who didn't want the new money. They distrusted the whole thing. So some groups of them got together during the last 2 years of the old money. They came together around charismatic leaders mostly and colonized towns in the backwoods. New Mexico had quite a few of those groups because of the mountains and the independent attitudes of the folks out here. Anyway, they kept the old money and set up their own economies. Of course, they had a bunch of farms around each town and stocked up on food, figuring that everything was going to collapse when the new money came in. Most of them expected a small war in the U.S. with riots and starving mobs going about the countryside looking for food. So they about made fortresses of their towns, and they picked places back in the hills which were easy to defend. You'd have thought that they were preparing for the end of the world." "So you call these towns palm colonies?" Neil asked. "Yeah, but I think it's all too pat. I think these places all fell apart in the first year or two after the transition. I think the rich payers took them over and used them for their playgrounds. I mean, why else would they let them continue to exist when the army could take them out with no trouble?" "I don't know. Those places are the only hidden places around. I mean, I've gone all over, and those are the only places you can't get in." "Why can't you get in? Are they castles or something?" said Neil, just stringing Jean along now. "They might as well be. They have roadblocks and armed guards. They also have these fences with barbed wire on the top," Jean replied. "Have you seen these with your own eyes?" Neil asked skeptically. "Yes, I have. They threatened to shoot me if I didn't go away. I was just asking for something to eat and a place to sleep, and you would have thought I was the devil himself. And they had guns and barbed wire on the fence." "Damn right they did. Guns with a big clip sticking out of the bottom. You know, military guns. They're trying to hide what they have up there." Now Neil was interested. He hadn't seen any place barred by guards in all his travels since he'd returned. Of course, he hadn't been to any army bases, but the airport only had police types sort of keeping the peace, not barring entrance. This did look like it might be the kind of place he was looking for. It was worth investigating at least. Neil first tried the local library. They did have some books on local history, but they were more about Billy the Kid and ranchers than about things since the transition. Neil could have used one of the library computers to explore the issue, but he felt that would just be inviting trouble. Such inquiries would be bound to bring him and his suspicions to the attention of the very people he most feared. He did ask some of the other students about places to go fishing in the area. He got several long, detailed answers to that question. They eliminated quite a few places as possible palm colonies, but didn't actually say anything about local places to avoid. He did manage to bring up the subject in a cafeteria discussion. He had chosen his group carefully. He wanted people who were from the central New Mexico area, which most were anyway, and who lived away from the cities. He also wanted hunter and fisherman types who might actually have had contact with the palm colony. He didn't dare risk bringing up the subject more than once, since that would be suspicious. By being from out of state, and even in many ways from out of the country, he felt that natural curiosity would account for his asking about them once. "What happened to the people who wouldn't accept the new money at the transition?" Neil said, hoping to edge gradually into the subject of palm colonies. "Some of them just left the country, but that was a tiny number. Most just said, 'You'll be sorry,' or 'Don't say I didn't warn you,' but really didn't do anything in particular," a student said. "There wasn't any organized resistance? I would have thought there would have been groups that would have resisted with more than 'You'll be sorry,'" Neil probed. Another said, "You better believe there were. There were some criminal gangs that practically went on a rampage for a couple of weeks after Transition Day. They thought there wouldn't be anybody around to stop them. Got shot to pieces for their trouble, too." "Wasn't there any organized opposition out here in New Mexico?" "Oh, sure, but they just hid up in the hills. They were no bother." "Whatever happened to them?" Neil pushed ever so gently. "They pretty much kept to themselves around my place. You have any troubles with them out your way, Marty?" "Nah, Jack, we don't bother them, and they don't bother us. They come out to trade sometimes." "What do they do back up in the hills?" Neil asked. "Well, I don't know for sure, but they make some craft work jewelry from silver and pretty stones. They also do some pottery and wool blankets," Jack said. Marty said, "I got my wife some beadwork from one of them once, but usually I just traded for the jewelry and blankets." "You've actually traded with them?" Neil asked, delighted. "Yeah, I was a farmer and rancher over near Manzano," Marty continued. "There's a pretty big colony up in the hills around there. Most years I could do quite a good business with them. Of course, I have to barter with them. The other farmers around there and I keep each other informed as to what we ask and what deals they offer, so we can generally keep the prices reasonable. And with Albuquerque so close, we don't have any trouble finding someplace else to take our crops." "What are they like?" another student named Steve asked, taking the burden off Neil. "They're just really poor folks trying to squeeze a living out of the ground. I think they keep their women working year-round on those blankets and pottery and stuff. It's all handwork, and it must take a lot of time." "Do they have electricity?" Steve asked. "I wonder why they stay up there if they see on TV what the rest of us are like." "I don't know. They really hardly talk at all except to Dicker. Lots of the stuff they want I don't have much of. They're always asking for medicines and ammo and metal tools, even stuff like nails. I did trade them a sports bow a couple of years ago and a few arrows, but I don't feel good about giving them ammunition." "How come they need medicine? Don't the doctors get it sent to them for free?" Neil asked. Jack said, "They won't let the payers in, and they won't let the computer make accounts for them, and if the payers can't see the benefit, they can't very well pay for it, so none of the pharmacies sends any medicine up there. I suppose they come to town to the hospital sometimes, but I can't remember ever hearing of anyone who did." Neil asked, "Why does the government tolerate them? Why don't they go in and get them out of there?" "Why should they?" Marty asked. Neil started to answer, but then stopped. "Because they are using a palm?" "What makes you think it's a crime to use a palm?" Steve asked, laughing. Neil said, "I thought Congress passed a law changing us over to the new money." "They did," Steve said, "but they didn't make anything else illegal." "I don't understand," Neil said. "If the government made a new money, didn't they make the old money illegal?" "No," Steve said, "just irrelevant. Look, if you have something that you want to trade with someone else and they want to trade with you, whose business is it except the two of you? Nobody's. If you're a businessman and want to accept some currency for a loaf of bread, if you own it, you can do it. But if that loaf benefits that other guy, then you and those who helped you get that loaf will be paid by the payers anyway, whether you accept his currency or not. So if giving that guy a loaf of bread gets you money anyway, he doesn't need to pay you, does he? So let's assume that he doesn't really need the loaf. He's just going to feed it to the seagulls. So he gives you currency, and you give him the loaf, and he feeds it to the seagulls. You got the currency, but the folks who helped you get the bread aren't getting paid anything. They won't like that, will they? So they stop helping you get bread. If we assume that you want to continue to get bread, then you'd better give your bread to people who benefit from it, so that those who helped you get the bread will be paid also. Now, given that situation, what good would the currency be to you? Who would want to accept it and trade? Nobody. Therefore, it's not a temptation to anybody with half a brain. The old palm just became irrelevant. It wasn't a medium of exchange anymore. Why should the government care what you do with it any more than they care what you do with the pretend money in a table game or Confederate money from the Civil War? So, Steve concluded, why should the government drive the palm colonies out of the hills? Neil tried again. Because they're probably not getting the medical treatment they need. Marty did say they wanted medicine. If they choose not to come out for medical treatment, we have no right to go in and impose it on them, Marty said. How would you like to be seized, taken to the hospital, and have some doctor treat you when you didn't want to be treated? But I'm not sick, Neil countered. That's what you think. When was your last checkup? Marty asked. None of your damn business, Neil shot back. Precisely, Marty said. Well, perhaps there's some children there who need medical attention, Neil said. We don't know that, do we? You want someone breaking into your house because you might be neglecting a child there? Jack put in. Maybe they're damaging the environment by cutting down all the trees or polluting the streams. Neil was running out of ideas. Marty said, I live downstream from them, and I haven't seen any pollution. If they're ruining the land up there, they're being very subtle about it. But if there was a big surge of mud or something like that in the water, we'd be up there in a hurry. We all depend on that river. I guess it wouldn't do any good to say they might be plotting or something up there, Marty was conceding with humor. Just because you can imagine something bad someone else might be doing doesn't give you the right to barge into their lives and take over. Besides, what would happen to the pay of a policeman who barged in and didn't find anything wrong? He'd lose pay for months over something like that. In fact, there's a good chance he'd be up on charges himself, Jack finished. So, Neil now had a focus for his suspicion. Nobody bothered the people in the hills. They did some trading, but they didn't need medical care from the hospitals. That in itself demonstrated that they had all the doctoring they needed right there in the hills. They also must have their own hospital facilities and some source of the medications that modern science had made available. It was clear that there was more behind these palm colonies than met the eye. Jean's flight of fancy and wishful thinking may have hit closer to the truth than Neil had suspected. The trick would be to find out some way to investigate without being found out. Invisible Hand, Chapter 31, History Lesson, in which Neil finds out why things went wrong. One of the classes Neil was expected to take included a brief history of money. In this class, he got a new perspective on much of history in general. All right, class, shall we begin? The young instructor's high-pitched voice cut through the general murmur of chatting students. This session is on the history of money. Since I appear to be the youngest person in the room by quite a few years, I won't try to tell you what it was like to live in a palm economy. I'm sure you know that far better than I. But since I've been up at university for quite a number of years, perhaps I can give you a new perspective on it and explain to some degree why things happened to you as they did. Let's start at the beginning of history. I realize that is a rather late place to start, but we don't have all day. By the time history began to be written, money had been in existence for thousands of years. Accounting had been invented, and money was well on its way to taking the forms that would seem most familiar to you before the transition. At first, money was, itself, something that one could consume. You might be able to eat it, or wear it, or wrap up in it on a cold night, or ride it. It took many forms because it was a commodity in each case. But it was a special kind of commodity, a commodity that was so widely used that everyone could be confident that if they didn't want to use that commodity themselves, they could easily find someone who would accept it in trade. This made each of those special commodities something new in the world. It made each a medium of exchange. A medium of exchange makes trade much easier because then trades don't require a coincidence of wants. That is, person A does not have to want what person B has, and person B does not have to want what person A has for a trade to take place between A and B. If person A has what person B wants, then person B can offer a sufficient amount of the commodity which serves as a medium of exchange, knowing that person A will want that. Then person A can go to person C and trade the commodity for what person A really wanted all the time. In this way, trade was made so easy that cities became possible, specialization became practical, and government inevitable. This was the age of agriculture. The great majority of people lived and worked on family farms and pastures. Only a small percentage lived in the towns and worked at other things. This meant that relatively few things were traded. Most things people used, they or their families made for themselves. Since so few things were traded, most people were experts on the things they traded, so it wasn't easy to fool the person you were trading with. But there were others who didn't want to trade. They wanted to take, by force if necessary. Someone had the bright idea to mint coins to provide standardized units of the commodity metal. Each denomination of coin was to have exactly the same amount of metal and be exactly the same purity. Thus, trade was simplified and increased where coins were available. In fact, the monetary units the coins represented became a means of indicating the relative worth for otherwise quite different goods. That is worth 3 coins, while this is worth 5 coins. Banks were invented as a safe place to store one's money if one could not afford strong boxes and guards. One could write a message to the banker to give some of one's money to someone else, and the check was invented. The bank could issue pieces of paper that represented a certain number of coins each, and the banknote was invented. It was while this development in the physical features of money was taking place that the concept of the account was born. If one deposited gold coins in a bank, the bank would record in a ledger that the deposit had taken place. When one returned to the bank to get some of the coins, one might be given other coins of the same weight. The coins were all supposed to be the same, so it shouldn't matter exactly which coins one were given, so long as one was given the number of that kind of coin one deposited. The number of the coins deposited and the number withdrawn was the account. From the depositor's point of view, the money was just a set of records. That meant that it was possible to create money which did not physically exist. For example, if a bank had 100 gold coins deposited by 5 people at 20 coins each, it could loan out 20 of those coins to a 6th person. Then each of the original 5 would have 20 coins each, and the borrower would also have 20 coins for a total of 120 coins. But the number of actual physical coins would still be just 100. So long as all 5 of the depositors did not withdraw their money at the same time, this sleight of hand in the accounts would do no harm, and the effective amount of money in the economy was increased. But sometimes, if the bank loaned out too much money, or if the borrowers were unable to pay off the loans, then the bank would fail and the amount of effective money in the economy would drop suddenly. I hope all this has just been only a review for all of you. I've given it just to get you to remember the circumstances of money's development. As you can see, the commodity money of 8,000 years ago and the money in the bank account are still fundamentally the same thing, just in different forms. A trader from 8,000 years ago would quite understand that you were giving something to another person in exchange for what they gave you when you wrote that check to pay for it. So the question I want all of you to consider is, what do all these monies have in common? What characteristic do they all share? If you cannot answer this question correctly, then you haven't been paying attention since the transition, the young man smiled cheerfully. There was a general murmur in the class of people saying, "Palms, they're all palms." Yes, he smiled, they are all physical object monies. They are all either physical objects, commodities, coins, paper, or represent physical objects, as in the case of accounts. That was the easy question. Now the hard question. What difference does that make? What is it about physical object money that matters? Silence. Finally a tentative. People can steal it? All right, yes, that is something that matters. If a thing is a physical object and usable as a money, then it can be stolen. Can our current money be stolen? No, in a chorus. Why not? Because it isn't a physical object, someone ventured. That's true, but many palms also exist in computer accounts just as our money does. Yet the money in those accounts can be stolen. There is some other characteristic of palm money that is different from our money, so that our money cannot be stolen and palm money can. What is that characteristic? You can't give our money to someone else. You can give a palm to someone else, Oscar ventured. Very good, Oscar. Yes, palms are transferable from one person to another. With our accounts, the money cannot be transferred. If money cannot be transferred, it cannot be stolen. Wait a minute, Neil interrupted. If money cannot be transferred, how can it be a medium of exchange? That doesn't make sense. Would anybody like to answer that question for me? The instructor asked. Okay, Natalie, have a try. My 2 girls sometimes didn't want to share their toys, even when they weren't playing with them at the time. So I would offer each a reward if she would let her sister borrow the toy for a while. That way, each girl gave up something to the other. They traded. The rewards I offered were the medium of those exchanges. But they each had a toy the other wanted to play with. They could have traded without you, Neil pointed out. People don't have to use money at all. They could use just barter, Natalie shot back. People were drifting. Let's concentrate on why a person gives up ownership of something to someone else, the instructor put in. DW, can you help us? If I have something you want and I give it to you, what do I get? With our money, if the thing benefits you, I get money. I'm getting paid for whatever it is. I'm trading the item for the money. The fact that the money doesn't come from you is irrelevant, DW finished triumphantly. But that isn't a trade. You aren't exchanging anything with whoever you gave it to. The payer gives you money, but you didn't give him anything. Neil felt on firm ground here. DW persevered. From my point of view as the producer of the item, I'm giving up something to get something. And so for me, it is a trade. For the person who buys that item, assuming it was a luxury item, they also give up something and get something. They give up money and get the luxury item. But the person who produced the item isn't trading with the person who consumes the item. They're each trading with the payers, Neil maintained and then thought again. No, wait, the payers aren't getting anything out of this. They aren't trading. There isn't really any trade here at all. If there isn't any trading, Clayton said, how come all those produced items keep getting into the hands of other people? How is it that I produce something and give it to others and other people do the same thing all over the country? It sure looks like trade to me. The instructor held up his hand. How many parties are involved in a trade, Neil? 2, of course. What else could it be? Neil replied. Wendy, how many parties are involved in a trade? The instructor said, turning to Wendy. In a POM, there are 2 parties to a trade involving money, though there may be many individuals involved. In our economy, there are always 3 parties involved in any use of money. In a POM economy, the parties are the buyer and the seller, or put another way, the producer and the consumer. In our economy, there's the producer, the consumer, and the payer. Our economy has 3-party trades. Wendy subsided with a somewhat surprised but happy look on her face. Neil, what is the function of a medium of exchange? What benefit does a medium of exchange provide for a society or an economy? The instructor said, turning back to Neil. A medium of exchange makes trade easier, Neil replied, shrugging. Go on. It lets people specialize. It allows people to do the things they're best at rather than having to do what everybody else does. Would you say that in our economy, goods are moving freely from those who produce them to those who consume them? Well, we all ate breakfast this morning, Neil grinned. When you worked, did anyone tell you what to produce or how you had to produce it? No. So if we don't have trade, how are these things happening? You've said that you weren't forced to produce. Why did you produce? I wanted self-respect. I wanted to be considered important. I didn't want people to think I was a slacker. The money was nice too, Neil admitted. So you were getting something back for the benefits of the work you did. You worked and you got rewarded. Does that sound at least similar to a trade from your point of view? The instructor was closing in for the kill. Well, I always thought of a trade as being between 2 people, not 3. But when you bought things back before the transition, how often did you actually give money directly to the owner, and how often did you give it to someone else? Weren't those cases in which you gave it to someone else cases of 3 parties, the owner, the clerk, and you? But the title went from the owner to me. The clerk wasn't involved in the transfer, or at least the clerk never owned the item. Neil's rearguard battle. Ah, but the payer never owns the item either. But wait, let's look at this in another way, which might make it more acceptable. Perhaps if you thought of yourself as trading with the society as a whole, you give the society the fruits of your labor, and the society gives you some of the fruits of other people's labor in return. But, Neil said, society isn't a person. It has no mind. It owns nothing at all. Individuals own things. There is no trade between an individual and society. All right, the instructor laughed. For some people, looking at it that way makes the idea easier to grasp. But something tells me that it's just possible that you aren't one of those people. So, let's avoid the word trade, since that seems to be a stumbling block. Neil, would you agree that at the beginning of the day, all property in the economy belongs to a set of people, and at the end of the day, some of that property belongs to people who didn't own it that morning? Sure, that's obvious. Would you say that this change of ownership was forced in some way? Would you say that it came about as a result of coercion? I haven't seen any, Neil conceded. Class, do any of the rest of you know of any case where property changed ownership as a result of force or coercion? There was a general shaking of heads. Oscar said, I know there are robberies and things are stolen sometimes. Do those count? Did ownership of the property change, or was it just the physical possession that changed, the instructor asked. I guess those are just changes of possession rather than changes of ownership, Oscar agreed. In fact, the instructor said, the possession of those items now that they are reported stolen can constitute a crime. It's very difficult to account for possessing property you don't own, especially if that property is stolen. So, Neil, all these changes of ownership should be called what? We can't call them trades, you say, because person A and person B are not exchanging goods with each other alone. What then are these changes in ownership? They aren't robbery or theft, because in those cases ownership doesn't change. They aren't examples of charity, because the people who give are getting something as a result of their giving. I don't know, Neil replied after a pause. Could we say that whatever they are, they correspond to trade in a POM economy? Ownership changes in a POM economy by trade, and ownership changes in our economy by this, shall we say, trade-like activity that involves 3 parties. Now, in our economy, there are actual barter trades which involve only 2 parties, so there is some of what you can comfortably call trade. But the vast majority of transfers of ownership involve payers and thus are 3-party interactions. So, to get back to our points, one significant way that our money and POMs differ is that POMs are transferable and our money is not. There are several consequences of this besides the fact that palms can be stolen and our money cannot. Can you think of any? The only way to get our money is from the payers. You can get a palm from anybody, said Clayton. Right. So what? Neil, what difference does that make? Neil was a little taken aback, paused, and then had an idea. The payers control our money because only the payers can give it to you. Palms can't be controlled so long as there is currency or coins or whatever. You can't prevent people from passing their money to whomever they want, regardless of what they're buying. You can make it illegal, but you can't stop it. That's why all the palm nations have black markets and organized crime. Clayton said, that also means that so long as the payers are moral, our money is moral, since you can only get it by doing moral things. Since a palm is used for all kinds of purchases, both moral and immoral, a palm must be amoral. Now wait just a darn minute, Neil barked out. Only people can be moral or immoral. You can't say that some physical object is moral, immoral, or amoral. It's just silly. Yes, Neil, Clayton said quietly. Perhaps I said that poorly. Payers use our money to reward good behavior. People use palms to reward all kinds of behavior, much of it bad. Thus, the Bible says that money is the root of evil. Oscar spoke. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveteth after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. I wonder what the Bible would have said about our money, Wendy mused. I think it is the root of much that is good among us. Class, we're wandering, the instructor said, back to consequences of money not being transferable. So far we have that it can't be stolen and that it's controllable. People don't try to cheat you when they buy things. We don't have all that misleading advertising and planned obsolescence and bait and switch and so on, said D.W. They know they can't get money from you, so they don't need to fool you, and they don't try. In a palm economy, you only have to fool some of the people some of the time to make a fortune. Isn't that just another form of theft? Neil pointed out. Yes, but we've been talking about theft by taking rather than theft by fraud, D.W. countered. I know, said Layden. There's no alimony or child support or property settlements in a divorce. When a couple get married, the money he earns stays his, and what money she earns stays hers, even if they get a divorce. A girl can marry for gifts, but she can't marry for money, she laughed. Back when we were a palm economy, there were terrible court battles over how much of the couple's money each would get. Some girls would marry rich old men and divorce them a year or two later and get a lot of money from them. Okay, well done, Layden, the instructor said. That is a major difference. Money belongs to individuals and not couples or companies or clubs because it's not transferable. If two people could share an account, money paid to one could be spent by the other, and that would be a transfer of the money. Therefore, we have no joint accounts of any kind for anybody. Palms, on the other hand, can and do have joint ownership of money from not only two, as in a marriage, to thousands, as in a club or a corporation. Can you think of any others? There's one that is a real biggie. The instructor looked around, especially at those who had not yet spoken. Did any of you ever work in a bank? Oh, I know. Credit, loans. You can't have loans or credit, Natalie said excitedly. Neil, why can't there be loans? The instructor asked quickly. Because a loan is a transfer of money from one person to another, Neil shot back. But what about credit? Why is there no credit? The instructor had a gleam in his eye. Because, well, let's examine the situation. If you wanted to buy a luxury, the owner could just give it to you, but that would be a gift, not credit. If the owner said, take it now and pay for it later, the ownership would not be transferred until the item was paid for, so there would be no credit in that case either. Since the transfer of ownership only occurs when money is deducted from the buyer's account, and since the money will not be placed there until the benefits are known, you can't actually buy anything until you have all the money. Neil sat back rather pleased with himself. The instructor looked at Neil with a grin and said, what about if the payer gives you the money now and says you can earn it later? That isn't legal, is it? They were telling us in another class that the benefit must exist or occur before the payment, and we have to record what that benefit is and how the work done contributed to it with the payment. So that would be against the law. Class, is what Neil said true? Is it illegal? You could almost hear crickets chirp as the class froze into immobility, hoping not to be called upon. The silence lengthened. Finally, Wendy timidly raised one hand just a little. I don't see how it could be illegal for the payer to give you money. The payers are making judgments. There isn't any law about how the payers must pay, because if there were, it would be Congress making payments. Then her hand was clutched in her lap. The instructor just looked at the rest of the class. More silence. Finally, Neil raised his hand and was recognized. I think I was wrong. I agree with Wendy. I mean, there couldn't be a law telling the payers how to pay. If there were, then those who made the law would be the payers. Besides, the payers could just ignore the law and it wouldn't be enforced. Neil, I am impressed. It took me years to understand that point. There can be no law controlling payer payments because no such law could be enforced. Therefore, all payments the payers make, no matter how outrageous, are legal. It isn't the law that restrains and motivates payers, since the payers, by the way they pay, control law enforcement. It's having to live among the general population at the bottom of the social class pyramid that keeps payers in line.
Thank you for attending today's presentation of Invisible Hand by Larry K. Mason, brought to you by GayTalkRadio.org and QueerPublicRadio.com. We hope you will join us tomorrow as the story continues at 9 p.m. Eastern Time at 6 p.m. Pacific Time. In case you've missed any of the episodes, you may listen to them by visiting QueerPublicRadio.com or by visiting Mr. Mason's website at www.nopom.info. That's www.nopom.info. Thank you for joining us, and as always, we wish the best to you and yours.